Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to Future Africa International Youth Discussion. Today we are commemorating World Meteorological Day. We want to have this youth discussion so that we can shed some light on this day as well as on climate change and climate action. So it is a very short program for tonight. We are going to have opening and introduction remarks, and then we're going to have remarks about the theme of the day by Mr. David Chikwaza, and then we will move on to opening discussions with our discussants on the topic of Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And then we will move on to, we'll open up the platform so that participants can ask questions, make recommendations to the discussion. Then we'll move on to the closing remarks and then votes of thanks and appreciation. I'm going to introduce our discussants for tonight. We are joined by two very knowledgeable young people. We will be joined by Dr. Eric Ngang. He holds a PhD in Indigenous Knowledge Systems from University of Ham in UK. He is a passionate environmentalist and a social and governance specialist. We will also be joined by Mr. Abu Simon. He is an environmental economist, passionate about climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk management. He got his master's in global environmental economics from University of Galway. Gentlemen, welcome to Future Africa Youth Discussion, and we are looking forward to learning and engaging with you. Without wasting any time, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. David Chikwaza to give us the introduction to the day and to Future Africa. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nandi, for this opportunity to be part and parcel of the program. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, joining us from different parts of the world for World Meteorological Day online discussion. Future Africa International is a non-profit company that fosters African youth leadership, development, action, and entrepreneurship. And climate change is one of the defining issues of our time. One of the things that have inspired this particular program, the subject matter, the points of discussion is what has been happening on the southern parts of the African continent. Recently Malawi was hit by Cyclone Freddy, and the devastation for those who have been following, maybe through social media, even mass media. I'm sure you saw the devastation, the trail of destruction that Cyclone Freddy left, as well as the many lives that were lost. This is not the first cyclone that has done this to that part of Africa. When I talk about this part of Africa, I'm particularly referring to Malawi. And Malawi, Mozambique, and other countries as well, such as Zimbabwe, have been on the receiving end of these kinds of cyclones. It has almost become sort of a permanent feature when it comes to that part of Africa. And we're just talking about cyclones. There are also droughts, so many things that are happening that are induced by climate change. So having witnessed all that, having seen all that, and even having also experienced and seen droughts, not only in that part of Africa, but even in other parts of Africa, issues to do with early warning systems, it's something that really becomes very imperative. And by this discussion, what we are simply saying is that Western science is not the only source of knowledge, it's not the only source of wisdom in terms of how we can make our communities more adaptive, more resilient to climate change. We can also tap into our traditional wisdom. We can also tap into our indigenous knowledge systems. And that is why we have very knowledgeable people that have taken their time to be with us today and talk to us about some of the key points of discussion. And I'm really, really happy to have Dr. Eric and also my brother, Mr. Simon. these are very knowledgeable people, like what Nandi said, and it is indeed a privilege. It is an honor to have them in our midst, talking to us about these things. As you might have also realized, the IPCC just published what they are calling the final warning report, where they are telling us that I mean, things are really getting worse. Things are not looking good, and action needs to be taken as far as climate mitigation is concerned. Meaning these cyclones, these droughts, and many other extreme weather events are going to be experienced. So issues to do with climate change adaptation, issues to do with resilience building, they become very critical. So that is what's informing this discussion. And it is also being informed by the idea and the imagination that young people have a critical role to play in as far as climate change, adaptation, and resilience building is concerned. As you know, Africa is a very youthful continent, and we all have a very critical role to play in making sure that our communities are resilient and adaptive. I don't want to preempt many things, but I just want to express my gratitude to Dr. Eric, as well as Mr. Simon, and everyone that has taken time to be with us today. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to such an enlightening and empowering an enlightening and empowering discussion in line with you know, the UNFCCC Article 6, which talks about education and training, something that is very important. This is a platform where we are getting empowered, where we're getting the knowledge, and we are being armed. So without further ado, I want to say a very big thank you again to Nandi for giving me this opportunity, and you're welcome, and looking forward to a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for that elaborate welcoming remark and introduction. Today's day is being commemorated under a theme, the future of weather, climate, and water across generation. I think that is a very deep and meaningful theme to today's day, given the catastrophes that the world is facing with regard to climate change and the very terrifying effects across the world. So, given that we are running out of time, we are faced with a crisis. Discussions of this kind set the tone for the role of young people and what young people can do in order to mitigate and to help the world adapt to some of the effects, to the weather, to the climate, and of course the water across the world. In this discussion today, we are looking to answer two key questions, which is how can Indigenous knowledge systems help strengthen Africa's early warning system? I'm going to give the first opportunity to Simon. Simon deals with disaster risk management, and as we are dealing with a disaster across the world, I just want to ask Simon, what is disaster risk management looking like on the African continent? Simon, the floor is yours.
I'll be taking us through basically what do we as young people have to do in as far as advancing the agenda of the early warning systems is concerned. Yeah, I've been doing quite research on climate change impacts, basically focusing on adaptation planning. And my research agenda focuses on using economic modeling tools. Basically, how do we forecast, for example, for the future unforeseen circumstances in the face of the extreme weather events. So to start our conversation, I'll give a bit of background information. We are looking like at every year or annually, disasters such as floods, cyclones, droughts, and tsunamis causing damage that goes up to a tune of over 314 billion. And that damage is reflected in our critical infrastructure. We are looking at agriculture, for example, and then buildings. So as today we are commemorating the World Meteorological Day, it's also true that 9 in 10 of disasters are triggered by water. It could either be excess water in a sense or limited water. So with limited water, we are looking at droughts And then when water is excess, we are talking about floods happening. So in Africa alone, floods have affected over 82 million people, killing an estimated 27,000 between 1950 and 2019. So also we're looking at about 1.4 billion people have been affected by droughts, and 1.6 of them have been affected by floods. So you can see within a span of 2000 and 2019, the kind of damage. So also when we look at the Sendai Framework Monitor, so it tells us that water-related disaster deaths have more than doubled in the last 10 years. That's by about a margin of 95% of the loss and damage basically being reported on infrastructure. So in an economic kind of perspective, we are looking at costs from majorly floods growing over time. And this is mostly attributed to growth in populations and assets in risky locations. So when we look at where we hail from, we are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. And so just 2 days ago, the IPCC released their new report, something that David calls like an awakening call. So it argues that it's highly likely that highly vulnerable areas are 15 times more likely to die. Like people who live in such communities are 15 times more likely to die because of floods, droughts, storms, to mention but a few. Just last month, there's been a cyclone that affected parts of Mozambique, Malawi, yeah. So that disrupts the social setting and the economic setup within our communities. So also in figures, the UNCCD released a report that says in the last 50 years, floods have led to economic losses of up to a tune of US$ 15 billion. And then the droughts alone lead to the largest human losses. So being young people, we see that these are the least studied kind of disasters in our communities. And yet the impact that they cause is quite extreme. So I'll give in a little picture about the research that I did with some colleagues from Venice in Italy. So we're basically looking at modeling the economic damages from floods that affected Mozambique in 2019. So we used what we call an impact transmission pathway, where we are looking at climate change. So when climate change occurs, there is an element of sea level rise plus wind. So that translates into cost of flooding. So we are looking at both inland and then the cost. So, and definitely there were displacements, people lost lives and things like that. So all this kind of perspective we're framing on how do we inform policy, for example, to attract the EU humanitarian aid. So in my approach, we say that economic damages, for example, are a function of both vulnerability, hazard, and then exposure. So which is the same case to do with when we're evaluating risks. So we used the flood damage functions to gauge, for example, that if your building is submerged, how much cost does it translate in monetary terms? So we also look at reconstruction costs. Then we use OpenStreetMaps. These are basically QGIS techniques where we map out that, for example, if it flooded this community, how many buildings will get affected, how many people get affected, about agriculture and things like that. So these are some of the findings that we had. So for example, the factual event alone is what occurred in 2019. And our findings show that over $257 million were lost, mostly to critical infrastructure, like we have the roads, commercial buildings, residential buildings, and then a portion of agriculture. So, and then in terms of displacements, we saw over 478,000 people were displaced. And then those who were directly affected were about 1.2 million people. So that is just the basis for the factual event. So now going into the future, for example, if we factor in forecasting techniques, so we applied the representative concentration pathways. All these are within the IPCC reports. So if, for example, we have extreme wind speed and then a 1.5 meter sea level rise, we see that the damages are going to more than double up. So we see about 1.7 million people being affected and then $871 million like in economic costs. So our findings are consistent even with what the World Bank reported. So this has an implication on what, for example, the EU has to come in terms of support and things like that. So looking into the future, as I'm wrapping up, as young people, there is a lot that we can do, and as far as curbing the threat from disasters is concerned. So there is an integrated framework for that we can all dive into. And as far as advocating for these things is concerned, the first one is we need to expand the knowledge of our societies on disaster risk. Of course, risk is a function of vulnerability, exposure, and then the hazards. So oftentimes we look at multi-hazards. So like in Africa, we see people suffering of not only maybe a flood, but there are quite a number of things. In 2019, we saw COVID coming on board. We saw droughts in some parts of, then we saw locusts. So it's plausible that the frequency and magnitude of this, we call them breadbasket failures, will keep on happening. So another area that we have to invest in is detection, monitoring, and analysis, and forecasting. So like the techniques that we used in our research were mostly forecasting-based kind of tools. So if we young people venture into this, yeah, there is a great deal of knowledge that relies within that. The other one is dissemination and communication. So there is a wealth of information that exists within us that we can put on board to advocate for these things. And then the last one is preparedness at all levels to respond. So preparedness is a very critical element of managing these kind of disasters. Of course, we don't need to wait for a disaster to occur for us to respond, but oftentimes it has happened, especially for the least developed nations where most of us come from. So as young people, we need to strengthen and increase access to disaster early warning information at community level. So where each one of us comes, remember when I was working with the GIZ in Uganda, we used to organize what we call community-based natural resource management committees, and we would empower them with information on early warning, things like that. So there is other important aspects of nature-based solutions. We are looking at a lot of encroachment on our wetlands, and yet those wetlands are kind of sinks for, like, they stop occurrence of floods in our communities. So I think if we go on training people and advocating for how do we advocate for integrated risk-informed policy making? So for example, if we are talking about policies, then they should be tailored with an element of disaster risk management. And then last but not least, we are looking at supporting risk-informed and sustainable investments. So as young people, we should be able to stop those investments that become a disaster in the end. Of course, all of us need development, but then development should be sustainable, basically addressing the needs of our communities without putting them into extremes of disasters. So yeah, that was it from me. In case of any questions, I think I'll be able to respond. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that very detailed presentation. It shed light on very key aspects of today's discussion, and we taken note of some key elements that are really fundamental and that are actually the reason as to why we host discussions of this kind. I'm going to hold on to questions from the participants now so that I give the opportunity to Eric, and then we will have the questions at the end of after you have spoken and Eric have spoken, then we will have our questions, recommendations, and contributions in the next agenda point. So I'm going to now open the floor to Eric. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nancy and David, for giving me this opportunity. It's always a privilege to come on board to engage in this intellectual discussions and kind of learn from each other. I really appreciate this. And well, before I get into the subject of indigenous knowledge and early warning systems, I might just take just a minute or two to talk about my work and how that situates within the indigenous knowledge and early warning systems nexus. So my research looks at law and policy making on climate change. Specifically, it's asking the question: how do this current wave of laws and policy on climate change enable or constrain the incorporation of local knowledge and practices? And I wish to thank Simon for that presentation. Of course, it still touches on the question which is at the heart of my work, which is, are communities only victims of this disaster, or they are able to make informed contributions rather than those processes being only top-down, informed by what the scientific world has decided at the level of the IPCC, at the COPs, at the declarations on Paris and all of that. And so that's the key question which my work really asks is, are communities only victims, or they can make a contribution to this process? So for me, I mean, the answer is no. They are agents of transformation who are not only waiting for solutions to come from somewhere to be able to save them from catastrophes, disaster, but in the whole process of designing early warning systems, they have knowledge, they are policy actors, they are decision makers that are able to bring on board their local knowledge and practices to be able to inform this process of identification of potential hazards and finding a way to protect, shield themselves against these hazards. But again, what are these local or indigenous knowledge and practices of communities? It's defined in different ways. There is no harmonized definition of what communities' local and indigenous knowledge and practices are. But of course, it's about communities' ways of knowing and doing, which they have developed over generations I like the theme of, the World Meteorological Day, which looks at an intergenerational aspect of climate change, disasters, and all of that. The local knowledge and indigenous knowledge of communities is intergenerational knowledge. It's knowledge that is transferred from one generation to another, developed through processes of experiential learning, collective learning, trial and error demonstrations. And of course, it's got the same value like scientific knowledge, because those who develop these knowledge systems have their own protocols, which they use to validate these knowledge systems. And they've used this over and over. It's time tested, and it's been where they've drawn upon to make decisions, where those high level policies, those high level decisions that I've mentioned that come from, these international forums take long, are difficult to even make meaning for communities, and communities readily draw into these knowledge systems to be able to make decisions for themselves. Of course, how do this knowledge system develop? I've mentioned the fact that it's collective knowledge is based on trial and error. Communities are continuously redeveloping this in order to be able to cope with the different challenges which they are experiencing, and this can actually fit into the decision-making systems which Simon alluded to in his presentation. Of course, this knowledge system, like scientific knowledge, of course, has its own challenges, which are worth mentioning. We've got the scientific world actually saying, oh no, this knowledge is marginal in terms of the results it can produce when it's relied upon for decision making. It's obsolete. It's going through a process of intellectual amnesia, because, well, the custodians of this knowledge system apparently it's felt that they are dying with the knowledge system, and this is where the whole issue of young people, where young people fit in this whole dynamics in terms of saving this important knowledge system of communities that is at risk of disappearance, or currently going through a process of intellectual amnesia. So how can youth take interest in this particular knowledge in order to develop the knowledge in interesting ways that more youths can take interest in the knowledge? That's a way to overcome the current challenge faced by this knowledge system. And of course, the scientific world also says, well, it's not possible to validate this knowledge system because it is tacit, it's found in the heads of those who develop and use the knowledge system. It's contextually based. It cannot be transferred out of the context. But my research in Kenya, looking at the law and policy making in Kenya, actually demonstrates that this local knowledge can be transferred from one context to another. It can be applied. We've got examples where communities have been able to tap from one another to be able to select resilient seed, climate resilient seed, to propagate climate resilient livestock species that they are able to grow in difficult moments when there are droughts. How they can look at their environment and actually tell you, look, by the time we see these caterpillars, we know it's going to rain, and it's going to rain heavily. I'll give you an example. Weeks back, I was in Laikipia in the north of Kenya, and I went there to facilitate a session on local communities and the use of their local knowledge for climate adaptation. And whilst we're having a discussion, they brought a caterpillar, and they say, well, once we see this, we know that rain is going to fall. Well, we accepted that this is the kind of knowledge that communities use in order to, prepare themselves for potential hazards, to take actions. They use that as a way, for developing early warning systems. And behold, when we left the community, along the way, we were met with heavy rainfall that flooded some of the roads, and we had to spend a couple of hours for the water levels to subside before we could get across. So that's an example of how community knowledge they've transferred from one generation to another, can be used to be able to help communities prepare themselves against hazards. But of course, there is a missing link because the youths are not interested in this knowledge. A population, of Africa, which is, 15 to 24 years are about 19.4%, and below 15 years are about 41%. And these youths are exposed to, the huge wave of information and communication technology. And there is value in that. And how can this local knowledge be translated into fun-filled kind of tools and games that, young people can take interest in to be able to continuously develop this knowledge system that is at risk of being lost. Again, we have the international level. For example, David mentioned about the Paris Declaration. Its Article 7.5 again says, for policies and decisions to address climate change, there is need for consideration of the best available knowledge, that is traditional knowledge, scientific knowledge. But again, those statements in those international policy frameworks are aspirational, intentional. They don't clearly demonstrate practically how can these knowledge systems be tapped into at the domestic levels. And so my research in Kenya actually examines, how can this knowledge system be tapped into, and what are the constraints that would make decision-making policies not to fully integrate this knowledge system. And because of that, I developed an actors knowledge institutional arrangement framework that can be used to evaluate, policies, disaster response policies, climate change policies, to examine whether they actually integrate these knowledge systems of communities where they have drawn upon to be able to build resilience against climate change. This framework can also be used to guide the development of policies. Like Simon mentioned, there's need for more policy integrated policies, but how can this happen? With this framework which I've developed, I'm sorry I didn't prepare PowerPoint to be able to show this framework, but I could share that. It's how can these processes where communities are engaged to be able to develop, responsive policies and laws that would help them cope with the negative impacts of climate change, how can they be fully involved? How can their knowledge systems be tapped into so that they can build frameworks that are responsive to the needs of these people, rather than having these systems that are developed from else, which have had a history of not making meaning for communities and often failing. So that is the way I look at what's the link between the local knowledge of communities and the issue of disaster response, and where youths find themselves in this whole process, where we have knowledge which is useful but is at risk of being lost. And we've got a veritable engine for the development of the continent in the youth. And how can we tap into this potential of youths to be able to get them involved in saving this very critical knowledge, which is at the brink of disappearance? So that's quickly what I want to share. And it's a lot I've said, and I'm happy to, take questions and respond to them, with respect to my work on what is it about local knowledge and practice. What is this knowledge? Basically, how can it be developed, packaged in forms that can be taken up in policy and lawmaking? Thank you very much for this opportunity again.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was a very good presentation. It's something that you can really learn a lot from. So if you have any material, especially on Indigenous knowledge and young people, that you can share with us, you can kindly share it with Future Africa, and we'll be happy to share it with our network of young people, because I think the subject of Indigenous knowledge systems is something that we should really look into, especially given the times that we are faced with, and given the fact that we are faced with a situation that requires for us to integrate knowledge in order to figure out what is the best way that can help us get out of this climate change catastrophe. Thank you so much, Eric. So we've heard from Eric, we've heard from Simon. I'm opening up the floor for questions from participants, but before I do that, I would like to ask questions from my side. I'm going to start with Simon. Um, Simon, having worked in the disaster risk management space, what do you think are the best adaptation strategies for Africa as far as climate change is concerned? So Simon, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think first to start with, I think adaptation is the most crucial aspect for us in the global south.
I agree with you.
Currently, I'm working on a project with the Environmental Protection Agency in Ireland. So we are basically looking at how do we decarbonize their systems, energy sector, agricultural sector, transportation, and industry and everything. So the component of adaptation to them is quite minimal because they have invested a lot into mitigation. So getting down back to us, I think the most crucial thing is, first of all, investing on the natural resources that we have. So I talked of an element of, for example, nature-based solutions. That's a very crucial adaptation mechanism that we can maximize on. We are looking at the stock of forest reserves because I know there's some, we are also struggling with climate crisis at the same time. And so the pressure on these ecosystems is increasing. So how about if we young people advocate for what is left? And then we talk about, for example, preserving our stock of existing natural resources like the forests. And then when I started my work, like with the GIs, and I talked about that, and we're basically looking at how do we try to plant more trees. So when I did my master's in climate change and risk management in Uganda, we managed to visit, there is a place that is so prone to landslides. So, and the biggest problem was the community members were busy felling down their own trees. And when a mudslide comes, there is no way the soil can be held firm. So it just gets washed away. So how about if we invested in, for example, telling our people the good news about having trees within our communities and so many others. So in as far as adaptation is concerned, it makes me remember recently during COP27, we have it's called the Sheikh El something implementation plan. COP27, there was a very crucial conversation around L&D, the loss and damage fund. So I know mitigation also comes, adaptation in our context comes at a cost. So if we are talking about building capacity of our people, maybe we are talking about planting millions of trees. So it means we young people should tap into the financing that's already available. So through my research agenda, I feel it's a very important thing, for example, to talk about going down into the books and say, let's lobby for this financing so that we can be able to implement, having in mind that we are the culprits of the devastating impacts of climate change. We are least involved into causing it, but in terms of bearing the burden and people suffering, stuff like that, we in the global south suffer a lot. It's amazing that even when you sit in the conversations, I know my brother Eric can attest to this. When you sit in the debates of people in the West, they tell you like, look, we are the guys who are causing all this burning of coal, all the fossil fuels and stuff like that. So then it means we have to do more justice in as far as responding to the crisis is concerned. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, there is more to do with us speaking our voices. Let's not get shy from this. So given that maybe dreams come to pass, I've been sharing with David that I need to start my PhD anytime soon. So basically my PhD will focus on how do we, okay, I was using the Joint Research Center cost estimates, which is basically skewed to the pan-European context to model the loss and damage that happened in Mozambique. So now going into my own research idea, I feel like there is need to go down into the communities to get the actual reconstruction costs. For example, what does someone in my town used to, how much did they spend building a structure? And then if, for example, a flood occurs, how are they compensated? So how do we tap into the for example, the loss and damage fund? So there is a lot that we can do. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Simon. I just wanted to have, you've mentioned a very important point related to COP27. You've mentioned loss and damages, and I think that is the center of the climate change discussion now in most parts of the world, in fact, all over the world. As young people, Simon, I want to ask you, do you think African countries are doing enough in terms of coming up with adaptation strategies that can help the continent? Do you think we go to events like COP27 with a clear idea of what exactly do we want out of the loss and damages funds? In your personal experience and professional experience and in your personal view?
Yeah, thank you. I think the answer is yes and no. Okay, from the yes perspective, yeah, I think what we sometimes perceive to be the right is, for example, sending in people to attend these COPs and stuff like that. There is already an element of knowledge transfer when we from the global south go into those kind of debates. But where I say, in as far as the conversation of around adaptation is concerned, we are looking at the mega kind of funding that comes to implement this kind of initiatives. Or sometimes the promises, actually, the most controversial thing is the promises that these agencies or the people who advocate for these policies, they promise that we are going to deliver on this mandate. But year in, year out, we see like nothing comes. Of course, we can't talk about the internal politics within our country's mismanagement of finances. That stands as a constant. And look, that already impedes the attainment of all these agendas once we bring in an element of mismanagement of finances. Because it may not be about only the money, but also how do we front in our kind of interests. Yeah, I think that's how best describe that kind of incident. But I think there is a lot that we can do. Of course, optimism should be our only hope in the end. Like, we have to strive and pursue the right paths and dimensions of addressing these things. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you so much.
All right.
Nandi, are you still with us?
Oh, okay. Thank you, David. Thank you so much, Simon, for a very good insight on the topic of discussion. We are faced with difficult times, and I think conversations of this kind are what we need if we are to shed light into what direction young people should take if we are ready to try and uh, provide solutions to the problems that we are faced with in terms of climate change. I'm going to ask the next question to Eric, based on his presentation, and I think it is evident that Indigenous knowledge systems are becoming a very prominent conversation, and who knows, maybe that is actually where our solution to this climate change situation are. I just want to ask Eric, how do you think we can integrate Indigenous knowledge systems with the modern knowledge systems that we are currently using? I mean, of course, Indigenous knowledge systems in most parts and over time are seen to be outdated, and people don't really, young people don't really understand them, and people aren't paying any attention to them. So how do you think we can bridge that gap to integrate the Indigenous knowledge systems with the modern knowledge systems that we are currently using in order to provide solutions to the climate change catastrophe? Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nanji. One word that sums up the question is co-production. I mean, I need to sound this note of caution when I did my presentation, that we should not be tempted to think we can, as communities, we can solely depend on our knowledge system to be able to proffer solutions to a Herculean problem as climate change, which is severe, extreme, disruptive. Yeah, that's the note of caution. We need to be, whilst we acknowledge that local knowledge and practices are very valuable to help communities quickly respond to challenges which they face when those decisions that are made at higher level are taking long to make meaning for them. There is need for caution, because sometimes over-reliance on those knowledge systems solely can lead to maladaptation. You know, coping capacity can be quite difficult when you are dealing with a huge hazard like, you know, climate change. That's one thing. So what I'm saying is, there is need for complementarity or a combination of that different knowledge systems. I mentioned Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement, and and subsequent COPs that focused on action in the Paris Agreement. If, for example, you look at the COP 2025 in Bonn, where the local communities and indigenous peoples platform was put in place. It was more of trying to get this knowledge system to develop it and package it so that it could actually sit well together with scientific knowledge, so that states or countries could develop very comprehensive, inclusive laws that took into laws or policies or actions that took into consideration existing knowledge systems, be it of communities, so that we shifted away from relying only on external knowledge and solutions that were informed by science. So there is need to look at that, this whole process of co-production, where the knowledge systems are put side by side, acknowledging that there are protocols used by local indigenous people that validates their knowledge systems, and not necessarily having the rhetoric that local knowledge must go through scientific lenses for them to be validated before they can be made use of. So it's giving value to these different knowledge systems, but of course acknowledge that science is more powerful. It's more powerful. Policy actors are involved in the science world. They are quite influential, and communities are less powerful, but of course they have that political capital. Their numbers, of course, is huge. They, for example, in Africa, you've got farmers who are the ones developing and using this knowledge, and they make over 70% of the population. When I talk of political capital, I mean those are people who policy actors can engage with in order to make genuine decisions that are legitimate, acceptable by these people. So for me, it's how do these co-production processes function? It's about giving value to these existing knowledge systems. For example, I mentioned, the communities in Laikipia in northern in Kenya, saying, well, we have this caterpillar, it's there, we can tell you rain is going to fall. And then you've got the meteorological stations saying, well, our readings are saying rain is going to fall or not. And then they bring these two knowledge systems together and say, well, if we put them together and say, well, there is a probability that rain is going to fall based on the local community observations, and based on what our weather stations are saying, we can strike a balance to say, okay, let us prepare ourselves for any eventuality, bearing in mind that these two knowledge systems are telling us this. So that is how, co-production, complementarity between these knowledge systems can actually happen. I mean, I hope I've addressed that, but there is more. There are more things which can be done in order to bring these two knowledge systems together, bearing in mind that they all have shortcomings. Scientific knowledge is developed beyond communities and brought to the communities to be implemented most often. Sometimes it leads to rebuttal, it leads to rejection, because people identify with that knowledge system, they don't understand it. The same as if you take local knowledge out of the context, people will say, oh no, it's obsolete, it's old knowledge, it's useless knowledge, it's dying with its custodians. We need to strike a balance and say, well, let's give value to these two knowledge systems, given that they have their inherent values and positive parts of them which can be tapped into to be able to help us cope with or adapt with or mitigate some of these negative impacts of climate change. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. I think it is a very delicate topic, especially given the fact that modernity is taking over the world and we are leaving behind most of this local traditional knowledge. And like you mentioned, it might die with its custodians, like the old people. And if young people don't show interest so that this knowledge can be transferred to the younger generation, then we might actually, at the end of the day, end up losing all of it. And like you said, these are knowledge systems that should both be recognized on their own merits, because they both, as much as they both have shortcomings, they do provide solutions that we need in times like this. And that is something that we should look into. Thank you so much for that very good response. I am now going to open up the floor so that participants can ask their questions and give contributions and recommendations. So if anyone, is there any questions, any recommendations, any contributions? I just raise up your hand and David will give you a chance to speak, and then you will be able to have the floor.
Maybe in a layman's words, the question that I would like to direct to Simon is, what is disaster risk management? What does it involve? So that the young people like myself can easily locate ourselves within that framework to say, okay, that's disaster risk management, and this is how I can contribute to the whole to the whole point.
For something, first of all, to qualify to be a disaster, you need to understand it stems from the word risk. So like in my presentation, I remember saying risk is a function of, we have exposure. So with exposure, we can talk about who are in the proximity of some likely event. The next element is we talk of vulnerability. So with vulnerability, we are looking at systems like people, like in some instances, people say maybe we are looking at the gender disaggregated information, or we are looking at locations. I remember talking about people living in risky locations. We're talking about population coming on board. So vulnerability of something is that if, for example, you were hit with a stone, and maybe you're young, then it's likely that that stone will get right to you. And then the third element is an hazard. Of course, most times people confuse an hazard to maybe a disaster, but it escalates to a level of a disaster when all these three components come into play. So once you have an hazard, of course, an hazard comes, and then combined with vulnerability, and then combined with exposure. So that is a crucial element in risk. So risk now translates into the broader perspective of us talking about disasters. So on average, when COVID came, usually if it killed like maybe 10,000 people, we wouldn't say that's a disaster. But remember, it went into millions and, of people. So we directly have to quantify it as a disaster. That's why the World Health Organization went ahead to declare it like as a pandemic, So coming back into your question, I think that kind of background, first of all, gives us an nexus and how these things are kind of connected, So first is people need to have the knowledge and understanding of what drives risk. So risk is driven by exposure, vulnerability, and the hazards. So, and then that consequently informs our decisions. So if we know that people in Mozambique, for example, are vulnerable, then it's likely that people who live next to the coastlines shouldn't be, okay, should be told like, look, maybe we can relocate you, the elements of relocation, rehabilitation. I know there are people who have a background in humanitarian response here. So that is a very crucial aspect of understanding the entire cycle. So, and then of course, going into the knowledge, the traditional knowledge, I remember in some communities, when we had a field work, they would tell us that this bridge used to flood up to this level. Okay, like the water level could go up to this much. And then there was a bell inside that was installed by the Western guys when they come for some bit of field work. So when that bell goes sounding, then it's sort of a message that has been sent to the community, and then people can evacuate. So when you go to some communities like in Uganda, we have people living in a place called Bududa, that's in eastern Uganda. So you will find some people are attached to their ancestral lands, and some of them tell you, look, even if these landslides keep on coming, we will not leave this place because first the soil is fertile. And so that has to be now our role as young people to say, look, disasters will keep on coming. And it's really true. It's not a lie. They will be coming and they're gonna be intense going into the future. So I think that bit of background gives kind of a much more simplified understanding of what we could talk in terms of disaster risk management and things like that. But of course, there is that general circle, like the things we're discussing now here, like that circle keeps on and on and on. Yeah.
All right, great. Just before I hand over back to the next person that wants to ask a question, or to Nandi, I have a question also for Dr. Eric. Dr. Eric, a very interesting area of discussion, the area of indigenous knowledge systems. From your perspective, from right where you are, how can we reach out to young people? How can we make them embrace these indigenous knowledge systems so that we have more resilient and adaptive communities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. One of the things I would say is education. Of course, the blame I don't know where the blame would be apportioned, whether it's on the young people who are not taking an interest in these knowledge systems, or the older generation that is not taking the action to transfer this knowledge to the younger generation, like it used to happen in the past, where people would sit around the fire and tell stories, and knowledge would be transferred, where young people will be on the farms with their parents. I remember I went to the farm with my parents, and I would see some of the practices they do. I know I didn't keep them because of Western education and being exposed to the Western world, but it's about you taking an interest in these knowledge systems, and also looking at policies and actions that continue to strengthen intergenerational transfer of knowledge. The theme of the World Meteorological Day says it all. It's about intergenerational actions. We feel we are cheated, we are losing that knowledge system that bear resilience in our parents, generations before us. We are losing that, and embracing, knowledge systems that sometimes are wanting. They are not helping us as much as they should help us in saving our environment, our immediate planet. We kind of embracing the knowledge that is helping us to destroy our environment. So it's about this awareness, it's about the education, finding an interest. Now, I did mention that the youths, are the veritable engines for the development of the continent. I mean, they are quite tech savvy. It's a lot of knowledge, a lot of, ICT knowledge. They can develop systems where this indigenous knowledge can be transformed into, transformed in fun ways using, ICT technology and tools, and into games where youths can be quite interested. I mean, these are just broad thinking, and how to get youths interested in this is to use some of the things that they are interested in, and feeding this knowledge system and saying, well, we can develop a game where we say, well, this caterpillar and this, for example, if we put them together with knowledge that comes from a weather station, you can actually know that rain is going to be severe, or there's going to be drought. So some fun field tools that actually, catch the attention of youths, and they can actually be interested in this knowledge. I mean, I like the way Simon puts it. It's a lot of talk about loss and damage. Again, we've got the importance of local knowledge and practices that would help in the psychological well-being, the mental well-being. We loss and damage, looking at infrastructure mostly. What can we tangibly see that has been destroyed as a result of climate change? But you can look at the social fabric, where people used to sit around the fire and tell stories, how that built social cohesion, how that kept people mentally strong, psychologically strong, and that's been broken. Are there ways where we can tap into this and look at, well, loss and damage is not only infrastructure, it's about all of this fabric that has been damaged as a result of climate change. How do we inbuild all of this and get youth to understand that our parents bear the thick skin? They were resistant to changes that sometimes were more challenging than what we are experiencing now, and they actually survive. Can we tap into those potential as youths and survive by doing the right thing, taking care of the forests and the trees, the environment, the waters, the wetlands, and all of that? Can we find an interest in all of that, rather than stick to the gadgets and the knowledge that is quite Western and is cut off from our context? So that's the way I look at it, and how youths can take an interest in this knowledge that is at risk of being lost.
Grant, thank you so much, Dr. Eric. And just back to Nandi, I'm sure there are now a number of people that have burning questions now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eric. Thank you so much, David, for those very important questions. I'm sure there are people that learned from what you have asked. And thank you so much, Eric, for sharing with us today. The floor is now open to anyone with questions, recommendations, and contributions. You can just unmute yourself and then you ask your question.
I think there's some question in the chat.
Okay, let me just read the question in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, the question is from Charles. Would you say the climate crisis knowledge transfer is selective and yet the effects are not? That's the first question. Are the mitigation solution more political or economical? Those are the two questions. Would you say the climate crisis knowledge transfer is selective and yet the effects are not? And are the mitigation solutions more political or economical? Those are the questions. Okay. Our discussants, whoever want to go first, if you want to take the first questions, please feel free and share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, that question or those questions are they of course when we look at the climate crisis, first of all, I think in terms of knowledge transfer, I think there is that element that we need to be aggressive in as far as going for this is concerned. Of course, and then when we talk about the impacts, looking at the atmosphere, for example, where most of these greenhouse gases go into, that's kind of a shared resource, like a common space. So usually common access resources or open, like it's more to do with an open access resource. So everybody is free to do whatever they want. So now the problem comes in that where the impacts end in the end come to societies that have no better kind of resilient systems. So that's why if, for example, a flood occurs, it's going to affect mostly those societies that do not have resilient, maybe infrastructure, resilient systems, or proper kind of early warning systems, you know. So I think to me it's more to do with the financial muscle, because people have invested in resources for this kind of services. Yeah, so we won't say maybe the knowledge transfer in a sense is selective, but what is for sure is that in the end, the impacts find us more vulnerable. Yeah, I think recently there's been a flood in Brazil as well. Yeah, so when you see this kind of economies, one is they have been thriving on their ecosystems. So once we tamper with a small section of, for example, an Amazon forest, you know what that means? Just a small portion of it. And yet if it rains, most of the water is harvested into the such kind of they're kind of absorbers and things like that. So that then translates into who gets affected more in the end. Yeah, I don't know if really that gives an explicit kind of answer to that question. Yeah, and then I saw the component of mitigation solutions being more political and what. So, but first, when we look at in sub-Saharan Africa or Africa, where we almost maybe in the audience come from, because I know there are people from other places as well. I think on average, I can say if I'm ranking from a scale of 1 to 10, I don't think the mitigation component even takes like maybe 2 out of 10. So it's just been about how do we adapt. So that's the honest truth. So unlike in the West, they have very nice systems. Eric can tell you what's happening in Birmingham, for example. Yeah, you find they have already gone ahead to construct flood defenses. So when I was working, or like where I work as an environment officer, you find in that small town, people would prefer to build right next to a river without even doing what you call a flood risk assessment. And I'm told a flood risk assessment is usually done for over a period of 30 years, because within those 30 years, you'll be able to study how a river behaves. So, but then climate change or the climate crisis is making it a little difficult for even this kind of studies, because a town that you never thought would flood or like wouldn't flood already starts to flood. So I think it's more to do with resilient infrastructure. And then, of course, it also goes back to our governments, that how do we advocate for these finances? Like earlier on, I talked about, if we do not have the right people to go and negotiate in those events, then we won't get the best out of those kind of conversations. And generally speaking, I think at some point we will have to say maybe a COP should be held online, you know, because if you look at the number of aeroplanes that were flying, over hundreds of them, and they're all using fossil fuels, for example. And yet that's the biggest conversation, that how do we decarbonize our energy systems and things like that. So it still goes back to, people have to be honest, you know. Dealing with the climate issue is an element of global solidarity. So once we have that global solidarity, then can come out of the nightmare of the impacts of disasters. And yeah, I don't know if that gives sort of a background, but feel free to get in touch with us. Yeah, I know my senior brother Eric has a wealth of information on how do we traverse this kind of statements. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you
Dave.
so much, Simon. And Eric, please come in and share with us.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, David. You actually hammered on that, you know, thoroughly. I mean, they say, you know, mitigation is political and economically incorrect for Africa. I mean, it's good for the West, as you put it. You know, there's a whole dialogue about net zero, which to me basically is transferring responsibility. If they tell us they want to, you know, buy carbon credits by keeping our forest, I mean, there's a bit of lots of discussions has to go around that. We need to understand all that process of, you know, carbon credits. I know it comes with a windfall of resources to cover for other developmental challenges, but again, we need to be careful as a continent on how we go into those kind of deals and sending the right people to go for those negotiations. This, in the West, they've got, you know, clear systems in place for their net zero, and we in Africa haven't reached that level, because we are not polluting. We're not grappling with the issue so much about pollution, whereas they are finding a way to cope with the levels of pollution which they are creating, and, you know, not actually taking concrete actions to address that. I think I thought I'd chip that in as well. Now there's another question there again about the nature-based solutions and the role of youths, especially in arid areas. I think, how can youths in such environments best innovatively respond to climate change adaptation actions? That's a part, it's impactful, and of course, throughout this discussion, we've actually highlighted the fact that the youth needs to take an interest in these nature-based solutions, what they are, and, you know, actively hold their local decision makers, you know, to be able to channel the appropriate resources which they need, and, you know, support them in the process of actually rolling out some of these nature-based solutions that would help them cope with with the challenges that they are experiencing in these different agroecological zones. So, I mean, if you probably in Kenya or all other countries, you would find that there are different agroecological zones, and the existing knowledge systems in those zones could be tapped into in order to enhance, the coping capacity of the communities, including the youth. So it's about finding an interest and looking at, what are the knowledge systems, what are the opportunities that exist within those different contexts that the youth can tap into. And there's the whole element where Simon mentions about advocating for what we really want. We need to be informed. We need to, engage in research and, evidence-informed, policy research, where we can use that to hold, decision makers, duty bearers accountable to our needs. That's where I see youths in this whole process. Youths can't be trying to advocate for things they are not knowledgeable about. They need to go out there, get the right information, and then, engage with duty bearers appropriately, even those going to represent us, as our proxies at, local decision-making processes, national decision-making processes, talk of international decision-making processes, should be decided by us, the youths, and say, well, this is our interest. As you go on board to represent our interest, this is what you take on board. These are the positions you have to present around the table, and not your personal interest and that of your family. And, and those are some of the things I see as, what youth should be doing with respect to promoting what they genuinely see as things that will help them cope with the challenges that are imposed by climate change, including floods, droughts, and what have you. That's the way I look at it. Simon might have other things to add on that as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Eric. Actually, personally, I hail from a pastoralist community where we believe in the cow, and surprisingly, even Ireland, where I am right now, the population of livestock or cows is more than the population of people. So Ireland has a population of about 5 million, and the cows are over 6 million. So going back to the community where I come from, it's called Karamoja in the northeastern part of Uganda, and strategically that question comes from there. So when we used to have sort of fieldworks within the community, you would hear the elderly men and women telling you that they used to prefer a system whereby cows just move from one community to the other, sort of free range kind of cattle keeping. So, and they had mapped the different migratory routes or like grazing areas. So in that way, they say that for them, moving from one grazing area to the other was sort of an adaptation mechanism. So which to me fits within the context of a nature-based solution. But earlier on in my presentation, I remember pointing out an element of the well-thought kind of investments that are disaster inclusive, like risk inclusive. So look, such communities are now facing a dilemma of mining coming on board. So if, for example, we are extracting a lot of minerals from, moreover, the most, I can say fortunate and unfortunate bit is that most of these grazing areas harbor a lot of minerals. So by land just being virgin and vacant, somebody comes and says, we need to establish an exploration around here. So before you know, you make it kind of difficult for the cattle keepers to access the grass, for example, for their livestock. So that makes it now more of longer movements, and longer movements breeding conflict. Remember, you're going into somebody else's territory. So that goes back to the point where I was talking about multi-bred basket kind of failures. So we're looking at conflict coming on board, We are looking at the climate crisis coming on board. We are looking at development as well coming on board. So as young people, how do we harmonize all these elements? They say that development reduces disaster risks. And at the same time, disaster risks also bring about development. But then the development that we're all seeking for should be sustainable. Yeah, so I think it's never too late for us young people to keep on having this kind of discourse and conversations on how do we uphold what was right in the eyes of the legendary men and women who lived a time before us. Yeah, I think that kind of gives in some background and feedback to Lucy. Yeah, but still feel free to get in touch, and yeah, we can still have much more conversations around those areas. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was a very well put response. And thank you so much for Eric for sharing earlier as well. And I think you guys really did a good analysis of the question and really gave very insightful answers to that. We appreciate that, and I want to state again that this is exactly the reason as to why we host conversations of this sort, so that we engage young people and we employ them into the international agenda of creating a movement of young people who are geared towards doing what is right for the world and continue to engage conversations that are able to change the world and that are able to change the world. So I had a call coming. I hope you guys have it. Yes. So if there's any other questions, the floor is still open. We still have, okay, we are a little bit over time. So we have 1 minute. If there's any more questions, please come forth with your questions. Then our discussants will be able to dive into them. We should make good use of this platform. We should really recognize the privilege that we have to have these two right minds among us today. So we should try our best to make sure that we get the most out of them. And of course, I believe their doors will be open even after this conversation, so much that we will still be able to engage them and for them to share with us further any materials or any knowledge that will really be beneficial to young people. We will really appreciate for them to share that with us. If there's any more questions, the floor is still open for 30 seconds. We went a little bit over time, but if there are no more questions, and I understand in some parts of the world it is a little bit late. Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, I just have one question, maybe just first of all, thank you, Dr. Eric and Simon, for sharing that valuable information with us. I'm really, really grateful. And the idea that you shared on making this kind of a game that we then get young people engaged is really an ingenious idea that maybe we can look at it further. If you really want to pursue that one, it can really work. But my question is, I was going to then go to that which you brought up, Dr. Eric, concerning the carbon taxes and the carbon tickets. Like, the reason why I brought up the issue to do, is it political or economical, is because we have those capital giants who are really maximizing on this crisis. Like, I know Bill Gates has bought some land in Utah where he's planting the trees so then he can get this carbon taxes. It's strategy. So I'm wondering, how do we then, as African youth, African young people, African leaders, try to also leverage on our natural resources to also venture into those, they're capitalistic tendencies, but they're really practical as well. Like, we already have our Congo basins. How do we then also be in that position to then collect the carbon taxes for Africa? Because we already do have natural resources that are really capturing carbon, but are not getting paid for it. Yet the capitalist guys are already maximizing on that, the crisis. So how do we get into those grooves, So yeah, that's my question really, to say, how do we then get into those platforms where we start leveraging and really try to make changes, but from an advantageous position as Africans, as Africa as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I mean, for me, it all boils down to capacity. in order to get access to the carbon credit market, we need to be able to fully engage in the assessments, knock on the right doors. I mean, Africa has always been shortchanged, you know. We've got all the resources, we've got all of that, but we lack the potential to be able to take advantage of the different economic waves that come up, you know, and we find the Western world quite advancing. It's about capacity development. How many youths take an interest in this whole carbon credit scheme, you know, carbon credit markets, building skills to be able to assess that. We've got red mechanisms in the different countries, reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation, which in essence were geared towards building home capacity to be able to engage in assessments and then take advantage of the global market on carbon credits. But again, I still see a gap in capacity in terms of many youths taking an interest in these areas that can actually result in tangible fallout, as opposed to, you know, I'm not saying reading literature and history is not important, but these are areas where youths can actually take an interest, and there are so many opportunities to be able to build capacity in this direction. The gadgets in our hands, the telephones, you know, rather than spend time on Facebook and TikTok and WhatsApp and, you know, and what have you, we can spend time building our capacity. There are free resources on, you know, carbon analysis, you know, risk assessments and all that, which are things that are sellable skills, which we can help our communities to be able to do the assessments of, you know, how much carbon stock our forest is producing based on the trees we are planting and the existing trees. These are things youth can take active interest in, and that's where I actually think it can help us to, you know, to better position ourselves in the global economy, so we are not shortchanged and we find it happening elsewhere. And when they come to support us, it's just transferring responsibility for them to continuously pollute. Whereas we can say, no, we have already the forest, you don't need to tell us what to do. We can actually, you know, take advantage of what we've had, rather than you coming to tell us what to do and then continue to do the wrong things. That, you know, in the long run still falls back on us. If they buy the rights to pollute, we still suffer the impact. So that's my take on that. It's about capacity development, searching for the right information, finding an interest in whatever is happening around us. That's the way I see it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eric, for that piece of information. I hope it answers Charles' question perfectly well. Well, we are now coming to the end of our youth discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. Thank you for sharing and for engaging our two bright minds that took time out of their really schedules to be here with us. So thank you so much, Dr. Eric. Thank you so much, Afam, for being with us here today and for sharing with the young people. We will be hosting events of this kind in the future. We always try to have an event for days like this, on the environmental calendar, so that we continue to engage young people on the continent on environmental issue and climate action. So feel free to join our events in the future. Engage us on social media platforms at Future Africa International. In our social media platforms are Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we are looking forward to talking to you guys again, to seeing you guys again. And we really appreciate your efforts and your expertise that you shared with us here today. Thank you so much, everyone who was part of this discussion. See you next time, and have a good evening.